Is traditional leadership taken seriously in South Africa? And what is its relevance? Good evening and welcome to tonight's Unfiltered. I'm Sizwe Mpofu Welsh. As part of our Heritage Month coverage, we focus on the institution of traditional leadership, which, since the dawn of our democracy, has been struggling to assert itself in its on and off relationship with the state. Despite its recognition by the Constitution, some say it remains weak, unequal, and politically vulnerable, leaving some to question how it is benefiting the communities that it is supposed to serve. So tonight we ask, what is the role of traditional leadership in today's South Africa? And joining me for this discussion, I'm very glad to invite from Nelspruit, the president of Contralesa, Kgoshi Matupa Mokoena. In studio, we have Ms. Constance Mogale, representing the Alliance for Rural Democracy, and political analyst who also researches traditional leadership, Dr. Levi Ndo. Let's watch this insert produced by Jacqueline Mapala for some context.
Pagama, 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 Ramaphosa iqisha. Oh, Pagama, you are the only president who, when I call you, you are taking my call anytime. The only president since I was a Kgoshi here. If you see my missed call, you are returning my call. If I send him a message, he will respond to that message. The first president ever who can do that.
The president of the Congress of Traditional Leaders, Kgoshi Matupa Mokoena, showering President Cyril Ramaphosa with praises for what he said was his responsiveness. He was speaking at the institution's 8th elective Congress last year, but exactly a year earlier, he sang a different tune.
If your partner does not love you anymore, in most cases, they don't verbalize it. You'll say by body language. We have noticed that the relationship is over, hence we are disengaging. We are cutting ties in terms of interaction with the ANC because we tried our best to have meetings with them, but they're not interested.
One of the many examples of a complex relationship between Contralesa and the government, marked by a sustained power play. On the one hand, the state pulling its purse strings for patronage. On the other, traditional leaders using the close to 30 million people under their traditional leadership, who, despite being shortchanged on service delivery, continue to be valuable voting population for desperate politicians every 5 years.
Traditional leaders, our kings and queens, have possibly the most important role to play in the development of our communities and country, because after all, you are closest, much closest to the people of this country. And so therefore, your role is the foremost. You stand in the front line of what should happen amongst our people, development, progress, and otherwise.
In their long-standing tussle with the state, traditional leaders bemoan, among others, their neglect and loss of authority, curtailed in the current constitution compared to the 1993 constitution. They call for substantive rural development, the strengthening and proper funding of the 882 traditional councils across the country, many of which are no longer functional. But the elephant in the room is they call for equal funding and status of royal houses. For an example, in the current financial year, the Zulu royal family received 79 million rands, a 12 million rand increase from the 67 million rand in the previous financial year, whereas others received just about 1 million a year. But what exactly is the role of traditional leadership in today's South Africa? Jacqueline Mapala, Unfiltered.
Welcome back to Unfiltered. Kgoshi Mokoena, thank you so much for joining us. It's wonderful to have you on the platform. The insert where you heaped praise on President Ramaphosa was nearly a year ago now. Do you feel that you are getting the support that you desired and spoke so passionately about from the government at this point? And do you feel that traditional leadership is being given the importance that you believe it should be given by the government, especially since the announcement of more interministerial attention being granted to traditional leadership?
Good evening, Sizwe and the fellow panelists, and thanks for having me.
Evening.
What I can say is that there are people who tried to render the institution irrelevant. Unfortunately, they failed. Leaders will come and go, but traditional leaders will remain. We are not happy, I must say, that the treatment that the institution is getting differs from province to province. We engage our president and the government. We had many indabas, summits, and so on, where we raised concerns that the institution is not taken care of. We did not expect government to really treat us like glasses or like some items and so on. All we are saying is that the promise that they made when they came into this new government, they said we are going to treat royal leadership equally, and we're going to make sure that the tools of trade are given to Amakosi and their people. What makes us not to be happy is that in all these years, starting from our late President Madiba, we have been raising issues. Those issues were raised in all the presidents that ruled this country. Even now, we're still raising those issues. I must say, yes, we're very grateful to the government of KwaZulu-Natal. We support what they are doing to His Majesty, the Zulu King. It's unfortunate that other provinces are not doing the same. The question is why. And if people are not really playing the ball, Amakosi will be left with no choice but as well to respond. But the question, how we're going to respond, nobody knows. But I must say, Sizwe, in theory, our government really are speaking so nice language, but when it comes to practice, they are not there, unfortunately.
And can I ask you, Kgoshi Mokoena, in terms of the deeper question of whether there's an incompatibility between traditional and hereditary forms of authority and South Africa's democracy, what do you think about those who say that those two forms of governance are fundamentally incompatible?
Leadership, it will depend from which angle you come from. But as far as we're concerned, I don't see any difficulty in both systems to exist. Because what we're calling for as the institution is not something that government cannot do. Yes, there is those are Republicans in our country who hate traditional leaders with passion. They don't want to see us being assisted in any way. But what I can say, leadership, is that traditional leadership and modern democracy and all those entities can coexist. So we're not here by mistake, and we're not saying we are asking favors. We deserve to be respected, we deserve to be given those tools of trade like they're doing with other entities. I can tell you this, royal leadership, they are not so difficult people. If it was not us, you can imagine what this country was going to look like. Where we are in charge of in rural areas, there is peace, there is harmony. We are protecting our culture. We are also making sure that if there are needs that affect our people, we are taking them and handing them over to the municipalities for them to render those services.
Indeed.
But unfortunately, in that one, it depends. Which municipality are you talking to?
And we will touch on many of the issues that you have raised. Of course, there were 26 such issues that were put squarely on the table of the president. Ms. Mogale, could I bring you in response also to this deeper question of whether in democratic South Africa you believe there is a fundamental contradiction between traditional leadership and democratic governance, or whether you believe it can be reconciled?
I believe they can be reconciled. I think in early 1999 or 2000, in early 2000, there was a bill introduced that was supposed to clarify the role of traditional leaders versus the democratically elected councillors. And I think that bill just went cold. I believe that traditional leadership and governance in the rural areas is critical, is key. But why has the parliament not defined the role of traditional leaders? And the traditional leaders, they can mourn whatever they can. They are responsible for their fate because they choose to clap with government when it suits them and not clap with government when it suits them. They should have insisted that that role should be clarified. Instead, they are being given functions. So they get salaries like they are wage laborers, like civil servants. So you are a traditional leader, then you are a civil servant at the same time. You know, traditional leaders like Kgosi Mokoena, in respect, they are not in the villages. They are in parliament, in Contralesa, in offices, classy boardrooms like these ones we are sitting in. When they were supposed to be in the village, where they should be a first line of defense when there is outsiders attacking communities. Our communities are constantly crying when big mining companies are coming into the village, drilling coal and copper in front of their yards, and the traditional institutions is there and muted. And you find old people who are in the council not having direction because the leader is not there, is attending some important meeting with President Ramaphosa. So they are responsible for their fate. Unfortunately, we also crying, we're bleeding to see our traditional leaders being respected, but playing a role that they were supposed to play to make sure that land is available for the people. People are eating, they don't have to come to the cities to squat in the squatter camps to look for jobs. We are in this crisis because of the muted traditional leadership. The KwaZulu-Natal he's talking about, there is disputes which are sided. We cannot ignore the land issue around dispute around boundaries where communities were fostered under another traditional leader which were recognized by Verwoerd. And that is why we are saying stop the Bantu stance. You can't expect me to respect you when I am in your court you remind me that you helped me, you gave me land. I am, in Setswana they will call you Ntoleng. Untoleng, you came here, we gave you a piece of land, now you want to speak in our courts. Okay. So they are responsible for the fate they are in. Unfortunately, they don't want to work with the civil society. They don't want to work with their own people.
Let me bring in Dr. Ndo, because you've made, Ms. Mogale, a series of very interesting points. Dr. Ndo, we're discussing this question of whether there is a tension between traditional leadership and a democratic society. Indeed, both Ms. Mogale and Kgosi Mokoena have said it can be reconciled, but the manner of that reconciliation seems to be in dispute. What are your thoughts on some of what we've heard in the different perspectives so far on how that reconciliation can happen?
Well, I think it's not only about reconciliation, it's about how they develop working relationship. The government and the constitution does recognize traditional leadership. And we can't argue about the role that they play in society. And my view is that as society is changing on a daily basis, it is up to the traditional leadership itself to redefine its role in society and how it can work together with government. There are a number of worrying factors about traditional leadership which has a potential to erode its existence. For an example, the issues that you raised about traditional leaders who are actually abandoning their own communities and they are not actually found in their own communities. What is central in traditional leadership? It's land. And what appears to be the challenge currently is that it might not be at a broader level, but we've got traditional leaders who are actually taking away their powers because they've started to sell their own land. And if you do that as a traditional leader, you are gradually eroding your role and power that you're supposed to be having as a leader. Other areas that, in my view, we need to look at is that traditional leaders, where they are found, are the ones who are supposed to be championing issues that are relating to development, issues that are much closer to communities themselves. Citizens should always find pleasure in running to their traditional leaders, because these are the leaders that are supposed to preserve their culture, their way of living, and these are the leadership figures that they have known since they were born. So it is up to them to sit down and say, how do we develop ourselves in a manner that everybody else who is found in our jurisdiction should actually see relevance in us and rely on us on many other issues.
Indeed, and Kgoshi Mokoena, we do have to go to a break soon, and we'll come back, and we still have a lot of time in this conversation, but there seems to be broad agreement on the role of traditional leadership in society, but in practice there are questions about the connection of traditional leaders to their communities, as well as the political connections that some traditional leaders have. How do you respond as briefly as you can to that, and then we will continue after the break?
Leadership, thank you very much for that question. I want to start by saying I respect the views by Ms. Mokhale, and I'm very happy that she sympathizes with the challenges that we're facing as traditional leaders. And I'm not going to throw stones at her because really we respect women in this country as traditional leaders. But just to correct some of what she said, traditional leaders, my leader, are not getting any salary. Up until now, they're getting a stipend. We've been crying about that since 1994 up until now, as I'm sitting speaking to you now. We're not getting any salary but stipend. Traditional leaders, leadership, they are found in their villages. They are there. If there's no traditional leader who is not in his area, it might be a very small percent, but there might be a reason for that. But the majority, 99.something%, we are found in our areas. When I leave this studio here, I'm going back to my community where I am staying. Leadership, as a contralesa, what we said is that will allow traditional leaders to belong to any political organization. We're not going to really channel them to say, you must belong here. So there's no way in which we'll be accused that we're sleeping in one bed with organizations or with government and so on. But there's no way we can be unreasonable and start throwing stones at our government as if, we can't reason. But we agree with her that maybe we should have done better. But up until now, if I can tell you, even in Parliament, during the opening of the National House, all the debates were raising all those issues.
Right.
The issue with the tools of trade.
And we will come back to that
for so many years. Up until now, we're not getting any response.
Indeed.
Thank you very much.
We have a very interesting conversation on our hands this Heritage Month about the role of traditional leadership and its institution alongside our democratic framework. Is it working? How could it work better? And how do we ensure that our country's people benefit both from our constitutional dispensation and the deep lineage and histories of traditional authority in our country? We'll be back after the break to ascertain which institutions are working, which institutions are not, and of course, the question of land. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're discussing traditional leadership in South Africa, its relevance, and some of the questions that arise out of that. Just to remind the audience, we also did invite the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, and they were unfortunately unable to join us tonight. Ms. Mokhale, before we went to the break, we were continuing with a debate that you sparked about the role of traditional leaders and particularly their link to the state and the way that they receive money from the state. Of course, Kgoshi Mokoena saying that it's not salaries but rather stipends. How do you respond to this question of the remuneration of traditional leaders?
For me, I don't think if you allow to a master-servant relationship where somebody has to pay you, it means you are being paid, or whether it's a stipend or salary. I don't want to argue with him on that because I'm not clear around that.
Sure.
But whether it's I give you something because you do something for me, okay? If traditional leaders stayed in their role to protect and preserve customary law and customary land, to make sure that outside that customary land, whatever it is derived from that land, whether it's natural resources in terms of vegetation or mining, they are able to dictate their own salary as traditional leaders and kings and queens, because they are masters in their own territory. All right? We are fighting for land. Right now, communal land doesn't have a security of tenure. Every dictatorman here comes into the land and they only meet the traditional leader or whoever, Nkosana Nduna, they make a deal, and then you see people around the village digging and doing things. They are busy abusing small-scale farmers, taking land which the small-scale farmers are using for grazing and for farming, small-scale farming, subsistence farming. They are allocating land. Now, big elites who were not able to honor their bonds, their mortgage bonds in the cities, are coming to the village, purchasing big pieces of land, and they're building big, beautiful houses in the rural areas. It is okay. I mean, I also built my beautiful house in my rural areas because I came here to come in and work so that I can build my village house. It's okay. But then, if I buy land from you and I buy my big estate that you don't even have, you think you still have authority over me? You don't have authority over me. Right. You're eroding, like a doctor has already said, you have eroded your own authority.
Indeed.
So right now,
let me bring in Dr. Ndo, because,
yes,
and I will come back to you, Ms. Mukhale, as well, but you've raised an interesting question that I think we need to also put to our other panelists. In fact, two. One is, in terms of the financial independence of traditional authorities and the relationship of, in some ways, dependency on the state, whether through salary or stipend, is that something that maybe needs to be transcended? How can there be greater independence for these traditional authorities in our country on the one hand, and then there's the land and tenure question on the other, which we might dive into a bit later. But can I put those interventions made to you by Ms. Mukhale, Dr. Ndo, and then we'll come to Kgoshi Mokoena.
There is nothing wrong with the government having to pay traditional leaders. It can be a stipend or a salary, whatever we can call it. It is because, firstly, constitutionally, they are recognized and they've got a very important role that they play in society. It's not a South African situation. It's happening in many, many other countries where traditional leaders are actually being given their status and they actually perform their different responsibilities. It is also possible for traditional leaders to be self-sustainable. They've got councils which have to deal with matters of development, challenges that are facing communities, but also traditional leaders have got a potential to develop programs and projects that can sustain themselves in a manner that they wouldn't be too much worried about what they are getting from government.
Do you think they've been able to do that so far? Do you think that aspect of the self-funding model, for lack of a better term, has been achieved yet, or are there? What's your view on the extent to which that's been achieved?
Well, there could be some who have actually done well in terms of ensuring that the little or many resources available in their areas is properly utilized in a manner that communities benefit.
Sure.
And they also don't have to talk much about the reliance from government. And there are a number of traditional leaders who have got projects and programs that they are able to sustain themselves. And whatever investment that traditional leadership is able to attract in their own communities, they can still be able to sustain their own livelihood
Indeed.
as traditional leaders. At the same time,
let's come to Dr. Apologies, Dr. Ndo. But let's just bring in Kgoshi Mokoena, and we will come back to you on that. But Kgoshi Mokoena, just on this question, before we also get into questions of land, on the one hand, there's the recognition of the importance of traditional leaders, but on the other hand, there's this view, especially raised by Ms. Mokhale, that in actual fact it would be better for traditional leaders to be more financially independent of the state. And of course, there are some examples of that. Do you think that perhaps it would be better to grant traditional leaders even more independence to actually break away from the state more, or do you believe that the relationship with the state is in fact a healthy one and needs to be improved?
Leadership, we suggested to government that provide royal leaders with their budget and see what they can do. Now, we are at the mercy of a person who is in charge of this department to check how much are they going to give for royal leadership. Look at traditional leadership where there are mining activity, where the traditional leader is in charge, or there's a good relationship between that traditional leader and the mining company. They are developing, things are moving very smoothly. I don't have to name those leaders, you know some of them. But unfortunately, even today, we're having an indaba here in Mpumalanga, where the Department of Minerals and Energy, they are saying they cannot, as a department, assist traditional leaders to have a good relationship with mining companies so that they plow back to the community. Now, the community and traditional leaders are at the mercy of that department for SLP. Now, we're saying this is absurd. If you empower traditional leadership in terms of you empower them economically, we can do things, my leader. Remember when some politicians came into power, and even before that, they were insulting traditional leaders, saying we are corrupt, we can't be trusted, and so on. Tell me today, who is corrupt? Who can't be trusted? You'll never find any traditional leader who has gone to court because of corruption and so on, but politicians. Leadership, we tried as much as we can to talk sense to the powers that be. But unfortunately, whenever we raise these issues, we're told to be patient, they're working on the matter. I just gave you an example that we started from 1994 up until now, raising same issues. If we are empowered economically, we'll do miracles. Let government be flexible and give us necessary support. We'll develop our own communities and make sure that the services are rendered to our people. We're not happy when our communities all the time, they will occupy the streets crying for lack of basic services. Now, as traditional leaders, it is a concern to us. Hence we are saying, let them try us. Yes, I understand Ms. Moral. Let me not respond to what she said, but as I said, I've got so much respect to our women in this country. Hence, I waive in responding to what she said. But I think she will understand the role of our traditional leadership in this country and where we come from. And all the input that we made to our government, where they're not responding positively. We are fortunate that, for example, here in Mpumalanga is doing its best in supporting traditional leaders.
Right.
You can't compare Mpumalanga with any other province in this country. We are doing very well here, but we don't want this to happen only in Mpumalanga, but it must happen in all the provinces in the country.
Let me bring in Ms. Mokhale there, and we are also going to engage with questions of gender and gender representation within traditional leadership, because that's a central issue also raised by President Ramaphosa recently as well. But just on the question of land, which you also raised, Ms. Mokhale, there's this thorny issue of tenure, particularly where many traditional leaders govern currently we have a colonial system of kind of state licenses. The question is, should it go, that land, directly to the people who are there, or should there be an intermediary authority between the people and the land? What's your view on the appropriate tenure regime? And relatively briefly, we will of course come back after the break to explore this in more depth.
Depending on your definition and understanding of tenure, for me, people understand tenure differently. They talk about title deeds and papers, but for me, tenure is to be able to belong to a certain place. You know, people are worked in the mining companies, people were migrant laborers, but when a person is getting sick, they know where they have to go to get healed, to get in touch with the environment and spiritually and healing. And even we see it today, black people still usher their corpses through the borders to go and be buried to the place where they feel they are belonging, they are people. That is tenure. And that is the role of traditional leaders, to make sure that they still preserve those places where we feel we belong. Customary law and traditional cultures doesn't have boundaries, like she is saying Mpumalanga is best or whatever. It doesn't have boundaries. If I am a vendor, it doesn't matter where I go and work and reside, in New York or in Cape Town, but I will still subscribe by the values and beliefs of a certain culture where I belong, and that is Kenya. And when we talk about land,
let's leave it at that now for now. We will come back to you. We just need to go to a break, and then we will come back to your very interesting definition of tenure, and bring the remainder of our panel in as well. Just a reminder, we invited the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs. They were unfortunately unable to join us in this conversation. We're talking traditional leadership in South Africa, a key and crucial institution to our democracy, but also one which presents a host of challenges and debates. Don't go anywhere as we continue those after the break.
Good evening, ma'am. We'll be following you just to make sure you get home safely.
Thank you so much.
Hey, cheers, guys. Have a good night. Have a good night.
Congratulations.
Fun night, I see.
Yep, I just got a promotion.
Fix it. Will I be able to open tomorrow?
We got you.
Water, a basic human right, left unprotected and neglected. As South Africans are left vulnerable to poor and failing infrastructure, waterborne diseases, unprecedented droughts and floods, we take a closer look at the country's decaying basic water services and its devastating knock-on effects on the well-being of all South Africans. SABC News, independent, impartial.
Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're discussing traditional leadership in South Africa. Dr. Ndo, we have been having a fascinating conversation, but we left off on the question of land tenure. Of course, South Africa is in an interesting position within these areas of traditional leadership because there's a raging debate about tenure reform. Should the people on that land directly own it? Should it be owned by traditional leaders, as we've seen in some configurations? What's your view on this question of land tenure as it relates to traditional authority in South Africa?
This is the moment where you need to see traditional leadership taking a leading role. But that leading role that traditional leadership has to take should always be meant to benefit the people that they serve. There are a number of areas where people have actually left those areas because they feel they could actually go and stay in other areas because they don't see the reason of staying in those areas. They're not attractive anymore. What I expect to see from traditional leaders, from different areas, is to make their areas very attractive so that citizens don't have to leave those areas. They should continuously go and stay in those areas because traditional leadership is making it happen or convenient for these people to stay in those areas. At the same time, you have got areas, as she has indicated, where you would know that some would actually refer to these areas as their ancestral homes, and they will call them in different names. You actually need to have a clear framework, and that's why you need the role of traditional leaders in these councils to come in and say, how do we then define our leadership and provide a clear framework on these areas where my subjects are actually staying. You need traditional leadership to do so. I like the fact that traditional leadership, it's a permanent arrangement. And you need to have sustainable and permanent arrangements which must benefit the subjects. And you don't need, you can need consultants, but the different councils that are established are the ones that should call the educated people in the communities to assist these traditional leaders, so that whatever is happening has to respond to the changing dynamics in society.
Kgoshi Mokoena, let's bring you in here because this is such a key question for our country, the question of tenure, especially in the places where traditional leaders exert such influence and power. How do we get out of this conundrum of creating true land ownership, but at the same time not being left in this perpetual debate where ultimately we go back to a colonial form of land ownership that currently obtains in many of these places? How can traditional leaders take us forward on this question of tenure, and what would your solution be on that?
Thank you very much, Sizwe. You are now touching at the nerve of exactly what is the institution all about. As we're talking now, Sizwe, the majority of our land is owned by foreigners, and those who were leading in the apartheid government, they are owning the large tracts of land. We raised this matter with the current president when he was still the deputy president. We were at the Beachwood Hotel. He promised us that he will transfer the land to traditional leaders and their people, so that we are able to allocate land to our people for farming, for business, or residential purposes. We are still waiting, Sizwe. In this country, when they are talking of land tenure, they are targeting land that is safe in the hands of black people. Black people in the form of traditional leadership. The 87% land that is owned by some whites and some foreigners is untouchable. They are not talking about it. When people are complaining that the tenure system in the country is uncalled for, it's whatever, they are only looking at the land owned by traditional leaders, not land owned by some people who don't deserve this land because they didn't even buy it.
Can I ask you this,
land by force,
Kgoshi Mokoena?
and those people.
Could I ask you this? Apologies for the interruption, but there are some who say that, in fact, rather than that land being owned by traditional leaders who would then allocate it, it should actually just go directly to the people who are living on that land. Traditional leaders may still have a governance role in that land, but they wouldn't necessarily be the actual owners of that land. What do you think of who should be the final owner of the land?
There is a proposal where they said that the will proposal where the title deed must be given to traditional leaders, and our people will be owning the land as well. I've never seen anywhere in any country where they said it's a free for all. We're talking of a communal land here. this land is owned by the community, but the traditional leader is the one who is in charge in making sure that there is stability in that land. If anyone suggests that the ownership of land must not be given to traditional leadership, then that person really had to wake up and smell the coffee. There is an act of parliament here, the extension of land tenure rights, where individuals, if they want to, they can go and apply to the department to get any form of tenure that they prefer. But that cannot happen. All they want to see is that only 13% of land that is in the hands of the real owners of the land, black people, are being led by Amakos. Why people are so scared in confronting the land that is in the hands of the whites, Mr. Van Donald and everybody else, and those foreigners. You go to Cape Town, Malida, at Sea Point or at the other side, the whole area is owned by foreigners. People are quiet about it. They're happy to smile and go there and dine and so on. But when it comes to the rural areas, they will even demand that no, the form of tenure must be changed because it's suppressing women and so on. Right. To us, that it means some people just hate traditional leadership. And don't want to confront the land issue directly.
Let me bring in Ms. Mogale there. Kgoshi Mokwena's made some interesting interventions on our land debate. There's so much we want to get through. We have covered this question of tenure, but there's also a question of the cost related with traditional leadership to the South African fiscus, but also the equality of treatment between different traditional houses in our country. Can you reflect on those questions? Of course, if you want to round off the tenure question.
No, I'm not going to the tenure questions. I want to respond to Mr. Ntate Mokoena is confusing me. He's saying land is communal, it's owned communal. But then he's saying there is a proposal that it must be going to traditional leaders. So I get confused that he acknowledges himself that it's a communal land, it belongs to the community. Okay? So customarily we know that this farming fields, this piece of land belongs to the Ndlovus. This piece of land belongs to the Mohales. So even if those people don't use that land, we know that we cannot touch that land unless we get consent of the Ndlovus to start using that land. And it has been respected culture even up to today. I come from the rural areas. My mother's house burned when she was still a young Makoti. And that land stayed like that up until we started building after COVID. Nobody touched that land because of the role of the traditional leader in the area who said, you cannot do anything without the permission of the Mohales. You know, so that is the role that we want to see. Now, the proposal, if Kgoshi Mokwena's meaning of traditional leader means an individual being himself, getting land, title or tenure of the whole communal land to himself, then that is wrong. I oppose that. But if it means that as a custodian and a traditional leader who is acknowledged by the people as according to the Traditional Leadership and Governance Framework Act, that the people must elect its council and the royal family knows who is the rightful traditional leaders. All those disputes that went to Nhlapo Commission and couldn't be resolved. So the royal family, the role of the Rakhadis, the Rangwanis must be acknowledged. We cannot be talking about traditional leadership and yet we're talking about Kgoshi Mokwena as an individual. Then we are wrong. We're talking about the institution of the traditional leadership, which recognize customary land rights of people who are living there and respect those land rights. And if there's any development or any changes of land use, there must be consultation and consent. Right. So that is my feeling. So I just wanted to respond to that.
No, that's fine.
If you want me to, okay.
We don't worry. We will, but we'll come back to the other question.
Budget and the budget allocation.
Indeed, and we still have another segment to go. But Dr. Ndo, we started this segment with you, especially about questions of tenure, questions of ownership. How do you reflect on the debate that's been had about whether traditional leaders themselves should own on behalf of the people under their land, or whether it's better to have the people themselves as direct owners, or maybe some situation between where there's a communal form of ownership that's somewhere between those two?
Well, with the birth of democracy, we talk about the people. And I think that is what traditional leadership has also embraced, that the land belongs to the people. Traditional leadership has got a role to play in terms of the administration of the land. And that is why, as she has indicated, there are areas, pieces of land that cannot be touched because they're actually known where they belong. But what we also need is that with the changing times, you need a situation in which you are able to fuse the current situation and bring in the traditional leadership setup. But what should always be in the minds of everybody is that the citizens, the subjects, should be the beneficiaries. There has been a number of areas where there has been conflict between the citizens and traditional leadership, and mainly on matters of land and how land is being distributed by traditional leaders. So what you need is a level of consultation between ordinary citizens and leaders, so that that trust relationship should actually exist and it will be sustainable. Indeed. So you need ordinary citizens to say, come what may, I know I've got my traditional leader who is always on my side.
Let's go to a break. We will come back with our final thoughts and conclude our discussion, tie up some of the different loose ends of this discussion. Remember to intervene in this discussion on social media at Unfiltered SABC, and we'll round off after this break with the final segment. Stick with us. Welcome back to Unfiltered. Traditional leaders are a central cog in South Africa's democracy, and yet there is debate about their role and relevance in present-day South Africa. We're in discussion on those questions. Ms. Mukhale, there are so many questions we could discuss, and this debate will continue long beyond our hour today. Questions of gender justice and equality as it relates to traditional leadership have been at the forefront of this conversation for many, many years. What is your view on the extent to which traditional leaders have come to the party in terms of gender representation and the rights of women where they exert authority and power?
Well, it depends, and it differs from a person, a human being, from a human being to a human being. Because Mbukwana has reminded me so many times that she respects women and, you know, is democratic. I mean, it says a lot about the way they view women. She always has to remind you. You know, sometimes when I'm around gender-sensitive people, I even forget that I'm a human. I even forget that I'm a young person. I even forget that I'm unmarried, because it is not about those. Because gender is not only about women and men. It's also about age and the marital status. So people can discriminate you. What we see in the traditional institutions, some practices are very bad for women. We have case studies in KwaZulu-Natal, the hailed kingdom of Zululand, where women, after their husband dies, their land is taken from them. Traditional leaders are quiet about it. We have some cases in Mpumalanga. We just had the recent cases and the TKLA, the Traditional Leadership and Khoisan Leader Act, where under Morei Puso traditional leadership, where women's land was taken from them because there is an investor who wants to do something about the land. And if it was a man in that household, they would have been treated differently. So these are the core issues that patriarchy has to deal with itself. You know yourself. We are not going to be able to harass each other and say you are a patriarch. You know yourself if you are a patriarch, and you have to deal with it. Thank you.
Kgoshi Mokoena, your views on this question of gender and how it relates to traditional leadership in South Africa?
Sizwe, please pardon me. I tried myself to contain myself in a form of responding to what Ms. Mokhale said, but we can't leave this one. It is clear, Sizwe, that Ms. Mokhale, she does not have a clue on how we administer land in traditional setup. So with the limited minutes that are still we are just left, there is no way we can educate her on how we're administering land as Amakosi in our country. But coming to the question of women playing a role in a traditional institution, it might be those isolated incidents that she's mentioning, which if it's happening, we are totally against it as Contralesa. But what I can say is that as traditional leadership, if I am to be inaugurated as a Hoshi, Bora Hadi and my sisters are the ones who must lead the process. And here in Mpumalanga, we're having not less than 6 women who are traditional leaders. In the 6, all of them are occupying high positions. They're not in those positions because they're women, but because they are capable. So I want to agree with her that there are times where we are, in Mpumalanga, we have just forgot about this one. She's a woman. She's a traditional leader. Hence, we are giving them positions based on their capability. We have long passed the stage where we're saying if the husband passed on, the land must be taken away and must be returned by the son and so on. If the wife remains, that land will be registered under the name of that particular wife of that husband who passed on. This thing of saying a woman is mntwana, she is whatever, it's long gone. If there are those isolated incidents that are still happening, we're not part thereof, and we cannot really protect or condone those practices. But as Contralesa was saying, in the country, we are equal. Our mothers, our sisters, we respect them, and they were saying even if they want to have their own land, there is no criteria to say we can only give land to boys in that particular family. We are saying even if a lady who is not even married, if she wants her own site or land, we are giving it to her. If she wants to plow or she wants to do business, we are giving her.
Right.
We have, as contractors, we have long passed that stage of saying these ones were treated differently and so on.
Right.
We're just fine.
Dr. Ndo, I'm afraid we're going to have to end our conversation with you because we only have a minute or so left. But just your thoughts on this question of gender equality and traditional leadership and the debate we've had to close us out.
Well, traditional leadership is based on custom and tradition, and it's hereditary. And the other fact that we continuously have to note is that ascendance to the throne in many traditional leadership, it's male-dominated. Even though we have got queens in some other areas, but of more importance is that in traditional leadership, women are given very important roles. And that is why most of the discussions that have to take place in traditional leadership, they will call the aunties, who will be the ones who will discuss very serious issues in traditional leadership.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ndo, Ms. Mukhale, and Hoshi Mukwena for a wonderful conversation, debate, and exploration of the centrality of traditional leadership, the role of Contralesa, questions of gender, land, and public accountability. Very much appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you for a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much for joining us once again on Unfiltered. We are hosting debates right at the cusp of our country's political landscape. Make sure to join us for the next installment of Unfiltered News, Unfiltered Views, and Unfiltered Conversations. Have a good evening.